chapter 11 right here. So chapter 11 is going to be good in that it's going to be very similar to what we saw in chapter 9, at least part of it. What made chapter 9 was hard and slightly more difficult was that we introduced certain kind of intense concepts, two really intense concepts. One was action potentials, and then the second was the actual mechanical contraction between the skeletal muscles. Chapter 9, the main focus is on nervous tissue, how they accomplish their job, what is nervous tissue, is it just neurons, and right, how do we coordinate? Because if you think about it, it's kind of really amazing how we are made out of 45, 50, 60 trillion cells. We can't even agree to the nearest trillion, how many cells we have in our body. So how we come from all these cells, and with all these cells that we have, we then somehow turn into a cohesive person, right? Even though we're made out of individual cells. Now, if you think about it, it's kind of like, overwhelming, right? To even worry about something like that we're made out of all these cells that are communicating in each other in a very minimal way. And yet, somehow or another, all those cells coordinate with each other and turn into functional cell, right? A functional person. Now, when we look at this right away, right, keep in mind that we want, I'm trying to go back here, I think I skipped a couple. Right, so functions of the nervous system. The main function, I'm just going to get it off because I want to be able to highlight stuff. So main functions of the nervous system right here is to receive stimuli, some kind of sensory input. It could be internal or external. Internal includes things like you're hungry and your stomach is growling, right? So that's an internal stimuli. You feel some kind of weird pressure in your chest, right? In the thorax or in the heart, that's an internal stimuli. External stimuli kind of makes sense, a little bit more sense, right? Any kind of sensation from the external, touch, pain, pressure, temperature, itch, those are all external stimuli as it refers to our skin. Light stimuli for vision, right? So those are all external. So the nervous system is to receive that sensory input, figure out what to do with that input by integrating that information. And what it's going to do is integrate all the incoming information and then connect it with previous experience, memory, emotions from those experiences. And then once it figures out what to do and integrates everything, it's then going to hopefully provide and initiate an appropriate response. So that initiation of response is important because once you have something, some kind of input coming in, you need to be able then to also be able to do something about it. That's the initiation of response, right? It controls the muscles and glands. It can control homeostasis. So if it's an internal stimuli, you are hungry, your stomach is growling, well, you're controlling, smooth muscles and glands, and you're gonna have that urge to eat so that you can maintain homeostasis. In the same process, right, if you're hungry and you haven't eaten in a while, your blood glucose is likely to start dropping already. So we want to make sure that the blood glucose doesn't drop to zero. So we need to maintain homeostasis of your blood glucose levels. And that includes mobilizing your stores of glycogen in the liver, fats eventually as well, right? If you have this longer fasting period. So then we can have at least some low level of blood glucose for the brain and the spinal cord to access the glucose that's found in the bloodstream. And then probably the one that we think about, the brain and the mind, establishing and maintaining mental activity, consciousness, thinking, memory, emotion. It can and it should get pretty deep. If you think about it, if it doesn't get deep, that means that, we're not really thinking into the brain enough, right? So this gets to be a very deep process where we're thinking about, wait a minute, what is consciousness? What does it mean to be fully awake versus being awake but slightly unconscious? You've seen videos where somebody, their eyes are awake, but they're not able to answer questions, to comprehend, to basically interact with their environment, right? When we think about consciousness, consciousness is the ability to be awake, interacting, and then recognizing and reacting with the environment. That is that conscious awareness right here. And we'll talk about where all these are coming up. And again, right, it's not just one single place. We'll see that where you see the functions of consciousness, thinking, memory, emotion. The big picture thing is, in terms of the nervous system, it's going to be a series of these neurons that are interconnected. That's how we kind of store that information. Next is, right, once we kind of figure out the functions, what are the divisions of the nervous system? So the components of the nervous system includes a brain, spinal cord, nerves, and then sensory receptors. You need some way to activate, right? You need to have some information you're taking in. Now, the nervous system is divided into two different subdivisions. The central nervous system, which I kind of want you guys to think about as a very powerful computer, right? And the central nervous system, not just a very powerful computer, right? It's the brain and the spinal cord, but it's the strongest, most powerful supercomputer you can have. So if you go on the internet, these are your $5,000 to $10,000 computers that people use. It's got the ultimate kind of great graphics card. It's got the ultimate in terms of your RAM, everything. So this is our central nervous system, some super powerful computer, and that's going to allow us to have multiple calculations, right, in a given second. We believe that even right now, with how powerful computers are, that we're still maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades away before we can build a computer that has the same processing power as our brain. We think our computers are super strong now, right? But compared to the actual ability of the brain to interact, to calculate, to make decisions and integrate as well, it still take another 2 generations of computing before it can catch up with the brain and our access to power and computing. Now, that's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is our way of bringing inputs and outputs to the computer, right? So the peripheral nervous system are our nerves. Most everybody have heard of the median nerve. Almost everybody has heard of a sciatic nerve. So those nerves bring information from a certain part of the limb, from a certain part of the body, bring sensory information to the spinal cord. It also brings motor output to that area of the limb. Whether that area of the limb has a lot of skeletal muscles, well, the sciatic nerve is big because the area that it goes to, which is your posterior upper thigh, and just about your whole posterior anterior lower leg. So it goes to all those skeletal muscles. That's a lot of skeletal muscles. And because of it, it's going to have a huge motor portion of that nerve, that sciatic nerve. It's going to be the biggest nerve we see. So the peripheral nervous system are our named nerves. They're going to be our receptors, bringing inputs to the central nervous system. So what I want you to imagine is this. Same thing with our computer analogy, right? You have the central nervous system, which is the super powerful computer. But what good is a super powerful computer if you don't have a keyboard, if you don't have a mouse? What good is a computer? So you need some way to bring in some kind of access into it, right? You need some way of accessing the information. If you have a super powerful computer and you don't have a keyboard or mouse, how do you know what you're doing, right? How do you bring that input in? You can't. Now, what good is a computer if you don't have an output? If you don't have the window screen? If you don't have a computer maybe or a monitor? If you don't have a printer? So you need inputs and outputs, all right, when we have a computer. The input methods are the keyboard, the mouse, and then the output is a screen so you can see what you're doing. You can send the information to the printer, so then you can then right? Print it out. You can connect to the internet by a wired or Wi-Fi connection, so you can send information to other people. So having that external way of bringing information in and then taking it out is incredibly important. It unlocks the power of our computer. If our screen is broken, what happens? Well, if your screen is broken, you might have a functional keyboard. Everything else might be functional. The computer is functional, but you can't see what you're doing. So the computer basically is a very expensive type of weight. That's about it, right? So our brain and spinal cord and our whole nervous system are very similar to a computer. We have this very powerful processing unit, the brain and the spinal cord, and in order to access it, we're going to need to bring information in. We need sensory receptors and sensory neurons to bring the information from your limbs into the spinal cord, up to the brain, so then we can process it. Once we process it, we need to take an output, right? You have that feeling that you've just eaten, right? And you don't want to overeat. So what happens? Well, your brain sends the information down that you are now full, that you're satiated. As a brain sends the information that you're full, then it's going to send the information down the spinal cord, out to the peripheral nervous system, to then cause you to have that sensation of being full. And then if you eat any more, you might feel so full that you might have to puke, right? Inputs and outputs. That's the function of the peripheral nervous system. Next is this very good picture right here, right? So anything that is not straight in line with the middle, right? So if it's right down the middle, the brain and the spinal cord, that's your central nervous system. Anything that's even a millimeter outside of it, that's your peripheral nervous system. So these are the spinal nerves coming out right here. Now keep in mind, information is going up and then going up and then down your spinal cord. Sensory information comes from your limbs, goes into the spinal cord, and then goes up the spinal cord into the brain, and then crosses over. So what we're going to see is all sensory information somehow has to go from neurons or nerves in your limbs. That sensory information has to somehow get into the spinal cord. Then it's going to make contact with another neuron and then send that information up the spinal cord into the brain, where it contacts with another one or two neurons, right? So all sensory information somehow have to find their way into the spinal cord, so then it can meet the next neuron in line to send the information upwards. So how do we bring that information in? Is by these nerves that we see that are paired. So you see one on one side, you see on the other side, right? So they're bilateral, they're paired. And this is for your left arm and your left limbs. These are for the right ones. And all information has to travel in and out through nerves, through going into the spinal cord region. As it enters the spinal cord region, you have what's called spinal nerves right here, right? And there are 30, all right, so there are about 31 pairs of these spinal nerves. And we'll talk about the exact numbers later, but 31 bilateral pairs right here. And it's gonna be where information exits and enters. So sensory information enters your limbs into spinal cord by these spinal nerves. Motor information exits. It comes down from the brain. Your brain controls all intended skeletal muscle movements. So when you want an intended movement, like typing, right? You're moving all those fingers pretty quickly. So you're having the brain sending that information in really quickly. The brain then sends the information down into the spinal cord, where then it has to send that information out to the limbs. In doing so, it exits out through some of these spinal nerves, this information. So these spinal nerves are very important. These spinal nerves allows us to connect the periphery, the limbs, allows us to connect sensory information from the limbs to the spinal cord. Spinal nerves also allows us to bring motor information out from the brain and spinal cord out through the spinal nerves to the target limb and target muscle. So spinal nerves are our link between the external areas of our body, or even the peripheral regions of our body, and the spinal cord. So when you hear somebody getting a pinched nerve up here, right? If we're lucky, it's just one of these nerves that are pinched. Usually we're not that lucky, right? Usually when we have a pinched nerve is a series of these nerves that are pinched. And now we have an issue bringing motor neurons out and motor signals out. Because you can't bring motor signals out on that side, you're going to have loss of motor functions on that side. Weakness, right? That is one of the big things we see when you have a pinched nerve. Tremendous amount of weakness because the motor signals from the brain can't exit. And now you can't send that information to the muscle. Even though you try as hard as you can to contract that muscle, you still can't. And then what happens is you can't bring sensory information in from that region because it's all pinched up. So you have a combination of the partial loss of sensation as well as now loss of motor signals and loss of strength as a result. Now, in terms of sensory receptors, the peripheral nervous system are a combination of receptors, nerves, cell bodies, and a collection of axons that kind of connect together in a nice network that we call a plexus. So the plexus we'll come back to in a second. That's probably the most difficult part of what we're going to mention here. So sensory receptors. In order to send information in, you need to know what that information is. Sensory receptors can detect things like pain, pressure, temperature, touch, itch, right? So all of these are all very non-specific, right? They're very general kind of informations. If you touch something with your hand, you can feel if it's hot or cold. We can feel as well if it's prickly and can cause pain. So these are all part of where it's not just limited in one area. Pain, pressure, temperature, itch, right? You can get a cut on your left index finger. As you get a cut there, it's gonna activate pain receptors. If you get a cut on the right pinky, you still activate pain receptors there. So they're very general. We find it just about everywhere in our body, right? Same thing with touch and pressure. These other ones right here, light, sound, odors, those are very specific to the skull only. So they're what we call special senses. But for all of these, we need a specific receptor for. If we don't have a receptor for it, you do not have the ability to sense it, right? So you might, and this is a big one, some people hear about, and it's pretty rare, but it's incredibly rare, but when people have it, it becomes newsworthy. People that are missing pain receptors, right? Pain is where our body tells us that it's uncomfortable doing what you're doing at that moment. So you better stop. If you don't, usually you're gonna have some kind of trauma as a result. So pain is actually a good thing. It tells us when to stop doing what you're doing. You put your hand on a hot stove top, all right? If you don't feel the pain, you keep doing it, and you're gonna have a third-degree burn. And then, God forbid, you can't remove your hand from the stovetop because it's melted on there. So we need that pain signal to come in really sharp, really fast, so then we can remove that limb before it gets a worse burn. So instead of a third-degree burn where you can't remove your hand from the stovetop, you can immediately have pain, you can flex and withdraw it, and you can just have a mild burn that starts to blister up. Now, you can recover from that mild burn that blisters up without having surgery, without having other type of medical procedures. But in a third-degree burn, you're gonna need to have a lot more done just to be normal, right? Skin grafts, right? As well as, kind of tissue grafts, just to get that to be somewhat normal. Now, those sensory receptors for all of these need to be connected to axons that are also sensory. So we're going to have a sensory receptor, and then we're going to have neurons, the axons of those neurons connected to it, right? Now, some of these sensory receptors are nothing more than split up endings of neurons. Some of the sensory receptors are really ornate. It looks like little onions, right? That we'll talk about later on. And they detect things like pressure. There's a reason why, in order to detect pressure, you actually have to push in harder than normal, right? Because of those onion-like Pacinian corpuscle cells are very deep into the dermis, and it's not at the very distal part in the epidermis. All right, so when you need a sensory receptor, the sensory receptor is connected to a neuron, specifically its axon. And what we're going to then see is that as part of the peripheral nervous system, we're going to bundle those axons together, right? So keep in mind, when we think about a nerve, we all know the median nerve, like in carpal tunnel. In carpal tunnel, that nerve, the median nerve, carries both sensory and motor signals. Sensory signals for all of these: pain, pressure, touch, temperature, tickle, itch even, right? All of those from the middle third fingers, right? So from your middle finger, the whole middle finger region, as well as the medial aspect of your index and medial aspect of your ring finger. All of those are carried, that information is carried in, all sensory information in those regions, carried in by the median nerve's sensory division. Now, that median nerve sensory division then contains lots and lots of neurons. Because if you look at all the different areas of your fingers, all the different areas of the skin on your fingers, all the different muscles that goes to those three fingers, right? All the different bones that are in those fingers. Well, all of those need some kind of sensory neuron, right, to send information to the brain from them. Well, we need to bundle those sensory neurons into part of our median nerve. And then, as part of the median nerve, we'll bundle motor neurons going to similar areas, right? So we have sensory and motor signals going through as part of the nerve. What we see of the nerve, and you've probably seen a picture of a nerve and it looks kind of yellowish or off-white. Well, that nerve that's yellowish or off-white are going to be bundles and bundles of those axons, right? Each bundle is a fascicle, each going to similar regions of your finger, each carrying similar signals. So the more of those bundles that are pinched in carpal tunnel, the greater the effect of carpal tunnel. So when people first get carpal tunnel, they might feel a little bit of a tingling sensation only on their middle finger, the very tip of it. And that's about it. That means that they're starting to have entrapment of that median nerve, but it's very mild right now. All right. And then as the carpal tunnel gets worse and worse, you have more and more impingement of that nerve, and more fascicles are taken out. Because more and more fascicles are now affected by the pinching, you have more and more sensory neurons affected and more motor neurons. And then by the end, if they're not wearing a brace, it hurts, it's numb, right? And you can actually see atrophy of their fingers. So these nerves are bundles of axons arranged in fascicles, and nerves are a combination of sensory and motor signals. That's a big one, right? Sensory and axons. So all nerves, right? All nerves. So you when we talk about nerves, it's the name nerves, right? We don't call the spinal nerves that we'll talk about later on. We don't really name it. We just number them. But the name nerves that we have, sciatic, musculocutaneous, phrenic, all those name nerves are important because they carry not just sensory information, but motor information as well. Now, the nerves come from spinal nerves that exits out from the spinal cord, like I mentioned, 31 pairs. And then in the actual brain region, in the skull region, instead of having spinal nerves, well, you don't have a spinal cord, you have a brain. Instead of having spinal nerves, we have cranial nerves. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 14. Right. Now, besides these nerves, which are just bundles of axons, remember, in a neuron, you have the cell body, the soma, then you have the axons, and then you have dendrites, right? That's the easiest way of just kind of understanding the simple components of a neuron. Well, the cell body is called the soma. Now, when we find the cell body of neurons outside of the brain and the spinal cord, we call it a ganglion. So again, right, a collection of cell bodies located in a similar region. We call that a ganglion when it's outside of the brain and the spinal cord. When it's inside the brain and the spinal cord, a collection of cell bodies is called a nucleus or nuclei. Now, if you have a collection of cell bodies and they're all going to be in very similar region, usually they're doing the very similar job. So we're going to see that in terms of the different nuclei of the brain, usually the cell bodies are located really close together and they're going to be interconnected to each other, doing very similar jobs and tasks, right? Same thing with ganglia. We're going to see right away that when we look at the spinal cord, there's a bump close to the spinal cord. It's not in the spinal cord, it's slightly 1 or 2 millimeters outside the spinal cord, right? But there's a little bump there. That bump means that there's something there that is nice and round. That's a ganglia. It's a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. Now, to make the name nerves, we have a plexus, right? All nerves. Let me see if I can go back here. So when we look at name nerves like that, all right, like over here, this is called the cervical plexus. The cervical plexus is going to be a collection of spinal nerves as it comes out, right? One spinal nerve does not have enough neurons to form a name nerve. So what happens? It's going to react with other spinal nerves to make a name nerve, right? So here's a big one right here in the leg, right? You have all these nerves coming out between L5 and S1. All these spinal nerves coming out. As all these nerve spinal comes out right here, their neurons, specifically the axons, start to interact with other axons from different levels of the spinal nerve, right? As they intermesh and network, they then form the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve isn't just from one spinal nerve that exits out. No, it's from a collection of spinal nerves that kind of fuses their axons together. As they fuse their axon together, they form a much larger sciatic nerve. Now, all these fusion comes from spinal nerves that network, intermix their neurons with other spinal nerves. In the process, it forms a plexus. So plexus or plexi are nothing more than extensive networking of axons, sometimes the cell bodies, located outside the central nervous system. This networking of axons means that you'll have certain axons coming from C3, right? So we name the spinal nerves based on where they're found. So here's C1, C2, C3. So you'll see C3 and some of the axons come out here. It's going to come out and mix with the axons from C4. And then a little bit of C5 axons come in to also add to the mix. In the process, C3, C4, and C5 kind of intermix some of their axons together to form this simple nerve right here, right, that we'll talk about later on. That nerve is the single most important nerve in our body bilaterally. Without this nerve, you will not be able to voluntarily breathe because this nerve, the phrenic nerve, goes to the diaphragm. And if you have ever heard of the saying, C3, C4, C5 keeps you alive. C3, C4, C5, that's C3, C4, C5. They form this nerve called the phrenic nerve, which goes to the diaphragm. If you have spinal cord trauma above C5, that means that you have interrupted some of the signals that goes to the diaphragm. So unless you want to be intubated, paralyzed from the neck down, have paresthesia, lack of sensation from the neck down, and then on top of that, intubated for the rest of your life, well, what happens is, right, all that will occur if this phrenic nerve gets damaged. And that gets damaged when you have spinal cord trauma or shock above C5. That's where we get the saying. Now, the different divisions of the peripheral nervous system, and I kind of started talking about it previously, right? So the peripheral nervous system contains sensory and motor. Sensory brings information in. Now, we're going to also subdivide these in a second. Sensory brings information in from the periphery. So this could be a pain receptor. You accidentally get a paper cut. As you get a paper cut, what happens? You activate pain receptors in your finger, which sends action potentials now up part of your nerve that we are eventually going to call the radial nerve, right? So you send it up this sensory neuron, the axon. The signals go up through the radial nerve, through the cervical plexus, into, right, the spinal cord region. As it goes in the spinal cord region, this is the spinal nerve as that neuron enters. So it enters, helps forming the spinal nerve, and then we're going to see sensory information takes a posterior route into the spinal cord, right? As it takes the posterior route into the spinal cord, it then goes through this area called the dorsal root ganglia. That area of the dorsal root ganglia, nice and round, right? The reason why it's nice and round is because the cell bodies for this sensory neuron that's sending that information in, well, the cell body right here is found in this region, right? And because there are lots of cell bodies found here, cell bodies are more round, right? This area becomes nice and round as a result. All right, so here's a cell body for this sensory neuron. The sensory neuron's axon extends from your limb, your finger, all the way up into your arm, into the neck region, right? And then into the spinal nerve region. As it enters the spinal nerve, it then takes a posterior route, not the anterior route. It takes a posterior route on its way to the spinal cord. In the process, that information, that action potential that's traveling up the sensory neuron, then in the process, it goes and passes the cell body of the neuron, and the cell body of the neuron is found at the dorsal root ganglia. Then the information continues past the cell body, and it enters the spinal cord. As it enters the spinal cord, it helps form this dorsal root of the spinal nerve, right? It helps form it, and now it enters the spinal cord where it's going to synapse with a second neuron, which sends the information up into the brain, right? So sensory portions transmit action potentials from different receptors in your periphery to the central nervous system. Sensory information always goes towards a posterior route. In the process, the sensory neuron that enters helps form the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Now, we're going to use words that are going to be interchangeable. Dorsal is identical with posterior. Some book will call this a posterior root, right? Some books will call this the posterior. No, usually they call it dorsal root ganglia, no matter where. But some books will call this a posterior root. So keep in mind, dorsal and posterior are interchangeable. Now, motor signals. Motor signals are slightly different. Number one, motor signals come from the brain and then has to exit the spinal cord, right? So they're slightly different. With motor signals, they're also called the efferent, right? Now, I usually highlight the E and the afferent by saying E and afferent, but efferent or efferent. So efferent is motor, afferent or afferent, right, is going to be sensory. So motor signals come and they start, and we're talking about intended motor movements, right? Not reflexes. Intended motor movements start at the level of the brain. Brain then sends a signal to contract the muscle downwards, down the spinal cord, where then it synapses with the second neuron here. The second neuron is the one that sends that information out to the target muscle. Now, we have talked about this neuron before. When we talk about this neuron right here, this neuron we looked at really close right here where the synapse was between the neuron and the muscle. We've talked about it at the neuromuscular junction where it released acetylcholine, right, at the synaptic cleft, where the acetylcholine then goes and binds to acetylcholine receptors at the skeletal muscle's motor end plate. So we've talked about this neuron, but we've talked about it when we talked about really close microscopically and looked at it only at the very end. Now we're going to take a look at the entirety of the neuron, right? The name of this neuron, very simple name. This is what we call a lower motor neuron. And it's going to have a cell body. And the cell body of the motor neuron is right in the spinal cord. It's found in the anterior part of the spinal cord. Then the cell body has axon that exits out the ventral root, R-O-O-T, right? As it exits out, it helps form the ventral root. And then as it goes up, it helps form the spinal nerve, and then it goes to its target muscle. This neuron right here then will eventually release acetylcholine to the skeletal muscle fibers, causing an action potential, and then calcium release, and then the contraction. So these motor neurons right here are going to be very important. And notice a real big difference here. There is a dorsal root ganglia in the back, but the front, the ventral root is very flat. Why? Simple, right? The cell body is what causes us to have the dorsal root ganglia. So it's a collection of cell bodies outside right here. In the motor neurons, the cell bodies are not outside the spinal cord. It's inside the spinal cord. And because of it, all we see of the neurons are the flat axon regions. That's it. Because the cell bodies are not outside, they're in the spinal cord, right? The axons are flat. As they exit out, they form this flat ventral root region. And because the cell bodies are not located out here, they're located in here, you don't see a bulge. Next, right? Somatic, autonomic. What's the difference? So in terms of the motor division, we have two different divisions of the motor part of the peripheral nervous system. So two different subsections of the motor division as part of the peripheral nervous system. The first one is somatic motor, right? Somatic motor division of the nervous system is from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. This is the one that's over here. That's this, right? From the central nervous system to the target skeletal muscle. It's very easy, right? It's voluntary. It contains just one single motor neuron, and that motor neuron has a cell body in the spinal cord and a real long axon. So if you think that, if you look at your foot, in order to move some of the toes in your foot, you have muscles in your foot. Makes sense, right? But to actually activate the muscles of your foot, we need a neuron that comes from the spinal cord. Then the neuron has to come all the way down and then synapse with muscles that are very, very distal. Now, I'm pretty short, so the neuron isn't that tall, all right, or that long. But if you have somebody that's like 6'9". You have Shaquille O'Neal, that's 7 foot tall. Giannis, 7 foot tall. Well, you can imagine how long that neuron is, right? It starts in the spinal cord, the cell body, and then its axon has to exit through the sacral plexus, then go down as part of the sciatic nerve, all the way down into the little toe, so then you can synapse with the muscles that can activate just a slight movement of that little toe. It's a one neuron system, right? It means that the neuron has to make that contact point all the way from the spinal cord to the target muscle. This is that same neuron where we release acetylcholine that we mentioned just a second ago, right? Now, the other type of motor division is autonomic. Autonomic is almost automatic. You don't think about it. Example, when you're about to work out, do you make your heart beat faster and make it beat harder so they can pump more blood out? Of course not. It just naturally happens. How about when you're nervous, right? When you're nervous, when you're a kid, even now maybe, right? Some of you guys are not as old as I am. I'm pretty old. So what happens is, right, when you are sitting next to somebody and, all right, they're handsome, they're good looking, you're single, they're single, right? And you might want to talk to them and you start getting nervous. Well, your heart starts beating really fast. Can't control it, can we? Right? You want to be able to control it so then you can temper down the fear, the anxiety, but it's really hard. The reason why is because you don't control it. This is part of your autonomic motor system right here. The autonomic nervous system right here goes from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. What do they all have in common? Involuntary. All of them are involuntary. Can you make your stomach muscle contract? Not your abdominal muscle, your stomach muscles that are smooth. No, not really, right? So these are all involuntary in nature. They're all subconsciously. I think the book calls it unconsciously. I don't like using unconscious because it has a different paradigm, different kind of a different connotation than what I think people think about with subconscious, right? Now, with autonomic nervous system, it's a 2-neuron system with the first neuron sending that information to a cluster of neurons. And then the cluster of neurons, the second neuron as part of our path, will send the target information to the heart, to the eyes. Now, let's see what happens. And I want you to think about this logically, step by step, right? Now, when we think about things step by step, it's our way of trying to figure out, all right, does this make sense? In reality, a lot of this is happening concurrently, right? So let's see what happens. You're scared, right? It was Halloween, you're watching a scary movie, it's raining outside, and then you hear something in your house, and you're scared. And you're scared, your heart starts to pump really hard. You can feel it beating out of your chest, right? And now we've activated part of our autonomic motor division. This is a sympathetic. This is fight or flight. There's another one that we now know, fight, flight, flee, right? So that's a sympathetic we're activating. When you're activating the sympathetic nervous system, you are ready to have physical activity. So you're gonna be able to fight, hopefully. So then somebody attacks you, you're able to defend yourself. Well, in order to do that, you gotta get the skeletal muscles ready. You gotta send more blood to the skeletal muscles. So then it's ready to move. At the same time, you wanna be able to get as much information in as possible. So one of the other things that happens is at the same time that the heart starts to contract harder with more speed. So then your heart rate increases. Why? Well, so then you can pump more blood to the muscles. At that same time, we also send outputs from the ganglia, send outputs to the eyes. The eyes then dilate. As the iris dilates, you can bring more information in. So then you're ready to move. just in case somebody is about to jump at you. Then the hair on your neck, right? That's always a thing, right? You always have that, like the hair on your neck, the hair on your skin stands up a little bit, right? Why does it stand up when you're scared? Should make sense, right? It stands up because maybe it can give you that extra millisecond of time. All right. You guys have felt something as it brushes against you, right? It might not touch you, but maybe you're playing baseball and you're not looking and somebody throws a baseball at you and it just brushes you and you feel that wind hitting you, right? You don't get hit with the ball, but the wind from the ball moving just kind of touches your skin, all right? You can feel that. Well, that's what's going to happen when the hairs on our neck stand up. As it stands up, any movement will trigger those hairs, and it gives you that slight moment. It's that slight extra millisecond for you to know that somebody's coming. So then you can react that slight millisecond faster. All this is happening without you controlling it. Because by the time you can actively control all of this, it's too late. So the autonomic nervous system is usually automatic. We have three main divisions. One that gets you ready for exercise and physical activity, sympathetic, right? This is fight, flight, flee, right? Fight, flight, flee. And the parasympathetic is the opposite, right? Now, what happened if your heart rate was like what it is during exercise? When you exercise, you're also activating the sympathetic response. What happens? You activate skeletal muscles, your heart rate increases, your strength of contraction and blood pressure increases. All is seen with sympathetic activity, right? So if you stay at full sympathetic output, it means your heart rate is at 130, 140 beats per minute. 2.5 times a second. Can you relax like that? Heck no, right? You guys have all had a test the next day or have a very, like a job interview the next day, and you're trying to sleep and try not to think about it. As you're completely thinking about it, your heart rate just, right? It causes your heart to just race. It's really hard to sleep. So what happens is we need another system that kind of pushes that away. That's a parasympathetic. There's like a yin and yang between these two, all right? I know I just co-opted yin and yang, all right? I'm Asian, I can do that, all right? So what happens is in terms of sympathetic and parasympathetic, there's always a push and pull, right? At rest, as you're sitting here, chilling out, watching, right, TV, hopefully not when I'm lecturing, but right after I'm lecturing, you activate the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is rest and digest, right? You can't rest if your heart rate is at 150. So what is it going to do? It's going to allow you to decrease heart rate. It's going to allow you to relax, decrease your respiratory rate. At the same time, right, as we decrease heart rate and respiratory rate, we're going to increase blood flow to the GI tract and the GU tract, because this is actually time when we should be eating as well. So as you're eating, to absorb as much nutrients as we can, we're going to bring blood flow to that area. Because in order to absorb nutrients, you need to bring it into your cardiovascular system, to your circulatory system. Then that circulatory system brings it to your liver and the rest of your internal organs. So in order for us to fully digest and then absorb nutrients, we need greater blood flow to the GI tract. That's in the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Regulates resting, vegetative functions, such as digesting food or emptying of the bladder. Now, everybody, and women do this all the time, right? My wife does this as she's working 12-hour shifts as a nurse. How many times have you been at work and it's really busy and you don't find time to pee, even though it's 8-9 hours? I mean, I don't know. I mean, women hold it for longer, but what happens is usually 8-9 hours, that's a long time to not pee. So what happens is you are at work, right? Because it's so busy, you have more sympathetic drive. As you have more sympathetic drive, you have more blood flow to the, all right, to the heart, to the muscles, to all the fight and flight systems. At the same time, you only have so much blood. So you're going to detour blood that was supposed to go to the kidneys. You're going to detour blood that was supposed to go to the GI tract. You're going to detour it to the muscles. So then you have less filtration in the kidneys. So you produce less urine. So then you don't even feel the urge to go because you have such sympathetic drive for a long period of time. You get home, you sit down, you chill, and next thing you know, you have a glass of water and you have to pee every 5 minutes, right? Why? Because after you get home, right, the parasympathetic kicks in, and now we're gonna increase blood flow to the kidneys at that point. And now you're gonna have greater urine output as a result of increased blood flow to the kidneys and increased filtration in the kidney, right? But that's why that sometimes when you relax, you're at home, you might have a glass of wine, a bottle of beer, next thing you know, you're peeing every 5 minutes, right? It's because when you're at home and you're relaxing, you're bringing more blood flow to the kidneys and you're gonna produce more urine as a result. Now, the last one is the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is a series of reflexes that are triggered by neurons that connect to each other called plexus, right? The enteric nervous system are a series of reflexes that can occur without consciousness, right? This is how we keep people alive in a medically induced coma, all right, in an unresponsive state. It's also how we keep people alive when they've been unconscious for a long period of time. As long as we introduce food into the stomach by a feeding tube, that introduction of food itself activates the reflexes. The reflexes then will start to increase the motility of the stomach and the GI tract. Then, because now we have food into the stomach, right? Your stomach starts producing more enzymes and hydrochloric acid to break down the food matter. And next thing you know, just by introduction of food, the person might be in a vegetative state, might not be aware or conscious, but with the introduction of food, we're able then to break down food and then absorb the nutrients, even though the person is not even aware of it. Why? Because it's a series of reflexes triggered by the enteric plexus, right? Now again, the autonomic nervous system is a 2-neuron system. The first neuron starts in this area that we call the lateral horn of the spinal cord. It's just someplace very different, right? So what I'm gonna do is come over here. Hopefully I can copy this. Yeah. And I wanna show just like, that might be a disaster. It's not too bad. All right, so let's move over here and look at the difference between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So, all right, both are part of the motor division, right? The somatic, right here, the cell body is slightly different location than the autonomic, right? So here it is in the somatic motor division in blue. The cell body is in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. The axon exits out the ventral root of the spinal nerve, right? Helping form that ventral root. And then the motor neuron exits the spinal nerve, goes to the target muscle. Easy, one neuron, release acetylcholine, perfect. You activate the muscle at the neuromuscular junction. Now, that is the somatic motor division. The autonomic motor division is slightly different. The cell body is in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, not the anterior. There's an anterior. The axon still exits out the front. All motor signals exits out the front, right? The anterior or ventral horn. As it exits out, it helps form the ventral horn. Then though, it synapses with a second, right? A second neuron as part of a ganglia. The second neuron is the one that goes to the target smooth muscle, the target cardiac muscle, the target gland, right? As it goes to the area, then it will hopefully activate or deactivate that region. Now that's the other difference. In terms of this motor neuron that's somatic, whenever it fires, it always causes the muscle to contract. This, depending on where it goes, right, can cause the muscle to actually be inhibited. So that is one of the ways it's kind of different. Is that, right, in a somatic motor neuron, it goes to the skeletal muscle and always causes activation of the skeletal muscle. In the autonomic, it can go and activate or it can deactivate, right? So here, this is the GI tract. This is our fight or flight reflex, sympathetic reflex. When we activate the second neuron, well, fight or flight. The last thing we want to do when we're fleeing an animal or fleeing somebody trying to hurt us, the last thing you want to do is stop and defecate. Not good, right? So what we want to do is then inhibit that smooth muscle movement in the large intestine. So then we can direct more activity to the heart and to the skeletal muscles because it's fight or flight. And there's that picture of it right here, right? So if you take a look at this picture, this dude is walking by himself in the forest, right? Never walk by yourself in the forest. They always tell you that, right? Always walk with somebody slower than you. That's always a real good one right there, right? Good advice is always walk with somebody slower than you. And this guy sees the bear. As he sees a bear, you have the signals coming in that you see the bear. The signal comes in through the light reflex, and you activate your special sense of sight. You send that information to the brain figures out it's a bear. You better do something. And then you both start to run away. As you start to run away, what do we need to do? Activate the skeletal muscles so then you can run away. At the same time, to make sure you keep activating the skeletal muscles, you activate the sympathetic nervous division so then you can increase heart rate, increase respiratory rate, so then you can bring more blood to the skeletal muscles. So then these two mesh up and now you can run faster for a longer period of time. And then this guy's off and running. Perfect. And again, right? This is a big picture one right here about how things are integrated. All right, let's take a little break. Quick 5-minute break, and then we will